Right, welcome to another episode of The Brown Perspective. This is your host Romero, and I'm here with my partner in crime, Eduardo Capetillo. How we
¿Cómo
doing?
estamos?
Bien, bien. Do you know who that is, by the way?
Claro,
Okay,
soy el juez esposo de Vivi Gaitán. Me acuerdo, yo sé que, bueno, vamos a hablar de diferentes temas hoy, pero definitivamente una de mis novelas favoritas cuando estaba joven era la de Vivi Gaitán, la
yeah,
Paulina Rubio y Eduardo Capetillo.
yeah. That is that the one with the is that the one with Punch also from Chips, the Puerto
You
Rican
know,
actor?
I don't know if he was on it, but it was kind of like the Mexican Grease. I remember
That's
that.
not. Is that Dos Mujeres Un Camino?
No, that's a different one. Oh
Okay.
man, that's way. Dos Mujeres Un Camino doesn't even have. Oh, it does have Bibi
Yeah,
Gaitán.
that was Bibi Gaitan, but
And then what was the name of the Mexican actress? La en ese tiempo estaba pues ya mayor, pero todavía tenía su encanto. Laura something León or
Laura
something like that.
Leon, yeah, you're right. Okay, so I don't remember my novelas, but I did watch both of them. But I'm forgetting the name of the other one with Eduardo Capetillo and Bibi Gaitán. Was it? Yeah, you're right. It was the Mexican Grease. It was Baila Conmigo. That's what it was called.
Baila conmigo. There you go.
I knew it was in there somewhere.
I was about to get cut your Mexican card right now.
Yeah, yeah. And before people start saying that we like to talk about novelas on every episode now, because this is like the second or third episode we talk about novelas. There's a specific reason why we're talking about the novelas today, and is because today we have a in today's show we want to talk a little bit more about the cultural background, not necessarily of Latinos, because we have all these things that we can relate to, but there's other cultures that we have here in LA, and I think it's good to talk about those other cultures, specifically the Asian American culture. Right? You were telling me that is it May?
Yeah, May is Asian American Heritage Month.
You know what? It's crazy. I didn't even know that.
What?
No, is that is Asian American Month? Is that something that is has only been observed in the last 5 or 10 years, or is it just that I'm ignorant to it?
I think I don't know when it started, but I know actually back at Brown, I know it was a week that is celebrating the celebrated Asian American history and heritage, and then I know since I don't like at least 10 years, if not longer, um, I know that the celebration of Asian American history happens during the month of May. And I think it's an acknowledgement, just like we have African American or Black History Month, we have Hispanic History Month, Hysteria Month, as some of us like to call it. But I think it's an important celebration. And I think May is also packed. There's a lot of things that happen in May. I know, well, we're recording and it's Memorial Day weekend. And I know that is a time to reflect on sort of the sacrifices and contributions of the men and women who served in the country, who served the country in war. And the fascinating thing about uh, China American history is like a lot of it, the more recent one has been impacted by war, right? So there was the war against Japan, then sort of the what happened with China and then China becoming a communist country, and then what happened in Vietnam and all those things. So in essence, the Chinese, the Asian have been both a part of the American history, but also they are this constant and I don't want to call them enemy, but this constant rival, right? Like there's this fear of the Asians, of the Chinese in particular, because of their how big they are, how much they impact. So this new series that I highly recommend, Asian Americans, is really good because it just talks about the history of Asian Americans and not just Chinese Americans. It talks about what happened during the World War II and the Japanese internment, and also talks about some of the Sikh and Indian immigrants that also came to the United States and sort of blended in with some of the African American communities in New Orleans and other parts. But it's a really fascinating documentary that I think from our perspective, from the Brown perspective, it ties a lot of the struggles that Latin American people, Asian American people, Native and African people have had together, both historically and then a lot of the interconnections, intermarriage, and ways that we've collaborated together since the beginning, I guess you can say.
And their history goes even further back before World War II. If you want to talk about the building of the railroad back in
Yeah,
the
and it gets into that. So the first episode, the breaking ground, and is really about that and the fact that right after, and I know we talked about this in the last conversation about Cinco de Mayo and the importance that was in helping the Union, one of the factors that play into helping the Union win. So after slavery was banned, of course you still needed labor. So the Chinese worked on the intercontinental railroad from from the west, and then you had Irish immigrants who worked on it from the east, and the terrible conditions. I mean, when you think about like digging freaking tunnels through the Sierra Nevadas and a bunch of other things, there's snow avalanches and things like that. So, anyways, the messed up part is that when the trains come together at Promissory Point, the Chinese are excluded from the picture, and then later on, once the railroad is completed, obviously there's a bunch of Chinese, mostly males, who are here, and there's this whole rise of white workers, and then that's where the exclusionary sentiment starts here in California and eventually makes it to Washington D.C., and that's why we have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is really the foundation for when we start treating um, immigrants differently based on their documentation.
Yeah, I pulled up the Chinese Exclusion Act because it's a immigration law specifically targeting a group because
Hmm.
of the specific way that Chinese were viewed, not coming from, not immigrating from Europe, coming from an entirely different continent, the East, and you still see the negative perception or and portrayal of the Chinese after that, and even leading up to World War II, and then even today, you still have some of it. Obviously, these days it's not as blatant in your face with a lot of
Hmm.
things, but you still have some of these um, like sentiments that linger. These these vestiges of the past. So I think as you were talking about this, let me think here. Okay, so let me go back to the page. I'm still stuck on not stuck, but I just wanted to go back and talk about the fact that I didn't really know that May is the Asian History Month when you want to celebrate that, and
Hmm.
how common do you think that is? Because so on the one side, I am more plugged in to mainstream culture and Latino culture, uh, but I also have a lot of Asian coworkers, and this is goes back even when I was working in New York. A lot of my coworkers were like Southeast Asia, not necessarily Chinese, but also a lot from Chinese and then some Japanese. And even now, I still have some. I took a trip to Taiwan with my. I mean, I
What?
call him Chinese, but technically he's Taiwanese, and he wouldn't appreciate me calling him Chinese because
No, yeah.
you know how things are between the
That's
Taiwanese and the
like calling
Chinese.
a Colombian Venezuelan, dude. Come
Yeah,
on.
I know, but you know how it is for Mexicans. Like Mexicans call all of them chinos, which
Yes,
I
which is
know
racist. Very racist.
it's incredibly insensitive. And I mean, if you want to call it racist, I
Yeah.
mean that we could debate that right, but I do know that Mexicans are incredibly culturally insensitive when it comes to the Chinese, and so I mean we're close, so I joke around with them about that. But we did take a trip to Taiwan 2 years ago, and we went up and down Taiwan. It was really nice. That was part of a larger trip to go visit other countries in Asia. But he never celebrates anything in May. There's, I mean, the guy's always drinking, right? So on the one side, he's always celebrating something, but
Yeah.
nothing. I've worked with them for 8 years now. Well, one of them, and the other one was from Hong Kong. And then there's a few, but the ones that I'm the closest to is just two of them. The ones that I'm closest to, and they
Hmm.
never mentioned anything about May being a month that's significant to them. The only month that's significant is February because of Chinese New Year,
New Year, yeah.
right? And so, how common do you think it is? That's why I asked you in the beginning. Like, is this something new? Because it doesn't even seem to be widely celebrated amongst the people from the Asian community. I mean, I have a very narrow exposure to that community, but if it featured more prominently in our culture, then I would think I would have heard something about it, or you would have heard some commercials, radio, something, right? But we don't hear anything about this. Maybe that's
Yeah,
part of
it's
the problem too, right?
so it is, and I think what you're saying kind of gets at the heart of the visibility or invisibility problem within the Asian American community. And then to your point, there's so many other Asian groups within that. I mean, you have the Chinese, Japanese, you have Filipino, and I know you Asian Americans also include, Indian Americans. But I think that's a fascinating thing because the documentary goes a little bit into that. So it goes into this, um, the fact that the portrayal of Asians is not great in Hollywood, and they usually are the ones that are the villains in the Hollywood movies and all these things. But then more importantly, there's also this other side, this myth of the model minority, right? And this really, which a lot of Latino, Mexican, and other Latino and other immigrants parents do is, okay, let's try to be as American as we can, and somehow if we are as American as we can, and maybe we retain a little bit of our cultural thing, this country, the U.S., will accept us and they'll embrace us and they'll see our contributions. And if I become a doctor or I become this and that, then I'm a good immigrant. So in some ways, right after World War II, there was a little bit of this, like the myth of the model minority, just as there was a concern about China becoming communist and then becoming sort of another strong geopolitical player after they kicked the Western powers out of China. And when we talk about Chinese history, I feel that you need to think about, this is history that goes thousands of years. And when you think about the richness of Chinese culture and history, it's and I took a course at Brown about Chinese history, one of the best courses I've ever taken. But it's vast, right? And there's a civilization that thinks in thousands of years, right? They don't have the same perspective as um as the US. I even recall reading that there's evidence that Chinese actually arrived in the Americas that are pretty earlier than Columbus, because they had the capability to do so. And then there's all these things that come up for me as it relates to Chinese and Asian culture in general. And also, there seems to be a lot of similarities with the Latino, and Latino and the Chinese way that we view um, elders, how we view culture, how we view families. So in some respects, there's so much that we have in common with Asian culture.
Yeah, you said a number of things there that I want to come back to,
Yeah. Yeah, I'm
and
sorry. I realized I was just going on and on. Kind of lost my destination there. But I know
yeah,
you can help me get there.
I think I know. The first of all, the when you were talking about the China being the way that they view themselves and the continuity of their civilization, it reminded me of the book that I read. I think it was last year. Martin Jacques. I'm not sure how to say his name. Jacques. I think it's a French one. It's called When China Rules the World.
Mm,
It's a really good read. So yeah, he talks specifically about what you mentioned, which is um, that especially the West, and he makes it a point to point out how the West has never quite understood China, like Westerners, because we always try to view them through our perspectives and our point of view. And a
Hmm.
perfect example is something like we see this quasi communist system that they have in China right now, and all of the Americans think, oh, it must be terrible to live in China because you don't have the same freedoms that we have here. Whereas in reality, if you go to China and if you talk to a lot of the Chinese people, they may be okay with that system, because at the end of the day, that communist slash hybrid system that they have right now with some elements of capitalism, or they call it socialism with the Chinese flair. What you end up getting is they've seen a lot of progress that has been made within a generation, and because they've seen that, they're perfectly fine with that system, whereas from a Westerner's point of view, it's not. And then the other one is how Westerners view China as a country, but he makes the point that China, as you mentioned, is more like a civilization state.
Hmm.
So that it's not just a country; it's an entire culture, ideology, way of thinking that spans thousands of years. And the part that struck me the most from this book, I mean, it's a really good book, and it has a lot of other things that I'm forgetting to recall right now because it's been a while since I read it. But the he talks about how, from a Chinese point of view, the this ascent that we have seen from China since it started opening up in the 70s, and the ascent, the acceleration of development and economic opportunity and so forth, that most Westerners see that as, oh, look, China is going to overtake the US in a matter of a decade or two. And we think of that as something that's going to be a shift in a paradigm, whereas the United States has been on the top for a long time now, and all of a sudden China is going to come and be the number one in terms of GDP and its influence and so forth. But from the Chinese point of view, that's just a return to the status quo.
Hmm.
That's a return to how the world has always operated. Because if you go back 1,000, 2,000 years, China was always the most prosperous in terms of development, in terms of its advancements, in terms of its GDP. China has always been number one in these things. It's only been this temporary blip, starting from maybe the 1800s, because and it wasn't really until until the Industrial Revolution that you started seeing these huge disparities between the West and China in terms of their development. One of the things that people don't talk about a lot about is the fact that China could have easily gone through an industrial revolution in the 1800s, but it was limited by by its geography, like the ability to have arable land, the ability to
Mm.
produce, the ability to tap into things. And by the way, so was England. England was restrained, constricted by these restraints. The only thing that opened it up for them is the fact that they were able to colonize the Americas. And all of a
Hmm.
sudden, you had this incredible increase in output so that you could generate cotton, you can generate all these exports that helped to fuel the Industrial Revolution. But where it started in Manchester, no way you have an industrial revolution if it's just this tiny city of Manchester, like one of the places, right, where the textile mills and all these other industries started springing up around the time. There's no way that you have that if you're still geographically constrained by the resources that you can tap into. And same thing was with
Hmm.
China, but then that's when this explosion happened. So that's only been, you know, 200 years, around 200 years. So that's how they see themselves. A lot of the Chinese, that's how they see themselves, as a return to to normal. To them, it's a return to normal. So I know that was a little long-winded. Let me try to just touch briefly on the other two topics that you mentioned. You mentioned that initially that Chinese are portrayed in a negative way in the movies. I don't think that's entirely true.
Well, back
because
in the day, I
well,
mean, it might be changing now,
yeah.
but
Well, they've always been stereotyped, but they've been stereotyped along the lines of this model minority thing, where they get stereotyped as being incredibly good at math, being like
mhm.
robots at math, and being scholarly, and being slanted towards the academics, right, and then towards the sciences, and being nerds and geeks. That's more of the portrayal that I've seen. And then the other one, oh, the model minority thing. You touched on something really important, and I think this is where I want to maybe expand the conversation a little bit more. You talked about Latinos, and I think you were making the point about how there's this there's this sense of trying to fit in, and being able to assimilate into American culture, and fit in. That's what you were saying, right? You
Yeah.
mind just elaborating a little bit more on what you were talking about? Because I think there's a lot of other topics of discussions right there.
Yeah, so I think that there's this sense, and actually in the documentary they talk about this, young Chinese boy that comes. He decides, I'm gonna become an American. I'm gonna pursue my dreams. He finds a Chinese girl that sort of has the same mentality to start a family. So they're trying to get, and they start a business, so they become prosperous, and then they're trying to get their kids into the schools. But guess what? Those schools are now, the dominant society doesn't want them in the good San Francisco schools. So as a start, at least in the West Coast, of sort of separate but equal, in terms of having different facilities for people of different races. So, there's this desire, and I know one of the reasons why many Latinos, why many of their parents or they themselves lose the language, is because there's this desire, this desire to assimilate, the shame that comes to being tied to either the language or your culture. And there's this thing, oh, you need to become an American, and if once you become an American, somehow you'll be accepted. But then there's all these racist stuff that still happens to you, that is still you experience. Um, so I know that, to me, that's something that is very common within immigrant families.
Yeah, that's where this is why I wanted to talk about this, because the whole idea of assimilating or selling out your culture in order to blend in, and that in itself is a dynamic that we see played out in the Latino community, amongst how sometimes in the interactions between Latinos. But on the other side is what you said, which is even the people that choose to go that route. And if you were to others, not I'm not saying I would, I'm saying if the ones that others would label sellouts, that have completely assimilated, have forgotten their cultural language, and are now even voting for Trump, right? That's how much they feel American. Even they themselves don't get the treatment that they would think they would have received by doing all those things. Like, they checked all the
Hmm.
boxes. They did all the things that they thought were necessary to become American and to assimilate into this culture, and then they still get discriminated.
Yeah.
They still experience that. Yeah, the one thing that the Chinese do that has always made me think, and try to dig a little deeper into how I feel about that, is how they adopt American names,
Mm.
yet they retain a second name that is a traditional name. So if you're Chinese, and you have a from specific whatever province you come from, then you will give them a Chinese name,
Hmm.
and but then the first name will be something like Roger, or Luke, or Simpson. And I remember having a discussion with my brother about this, and it didn't go very well. It didn't go very well
Why?
because the more I think about that strategy, the more I realize that that's something that I think is extremely practical and effective.
Mm-hmm.
Because look, at the end of the day, what you care about when you go to a new country is to succeed and to get ahead and improve your economic situation for yourself and your family. And so you have to do what it takes to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And if and here's the thing, here's I think where my brother and I got into it, because to him that was a complete selling out of your culture. Like, oh, I wouldn't, and then he said, I would never give up my identity, or I would never give up my name like that just to blend in, right? Because I'm very proud, and I rather maintain that. And then I told him, I said, well, just because you change your name doesn't mean you're giving up your culture. You're just changing
Mm-hmm.
your name.
It's like a
If
nickname, right?
Yeah, like, I mean, but some people are very sensitive about a name, about changing your name. They want to have that traditional name. And I came to the conclusion that I don't think it really matters that much, because it's not like you're giving. It's not like let's say I were to do that, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
not like I'm giving up my entire culture. I'm just I'm just looking at the situation and saying, does having an American name give me an advantage in this area or that area? And yeah, it happened. It actually does in some
Yeah.
respects. So just go with the outcome that gives you the best results. That's one way of thinking about it. That's one way that I've been thinking about it. But like I told you in last week's episode, my way of thinking is very fluid. What I think today may not necessarily be what I think tomorrow. I'm always reevaluating and reassessing these things. But so far, I felt like that's actually a pretty smart thing to do, because
Yeah.
it's not like they're giving up any. Well, it's not like they're giving up their culture, but in the sense that they're not choosing to detach themselves from their culture willingly, which is something that
Mm-hmm.
actually happens though if you stick around in America long enough anyway, right? So even if you don't change your name, even if you want to hold on to your culture, your kids are not going to hold on to that culture the same way. And by the time they have kids, it's not going to be the same. Eventually, it becomes a blend. And you get to the point where these kids go back to China and they don't even fit in. Just the same way that a Colombian American kid whose parents try to raise them as much as they can to be Colombian American, take him back to Colombia and he doesn't fit in like a guy from Colombia, because the guy in America is now different. He watches American football. He does all these other things that are considered American, and they see him differently in Colombia anyway. So you're, in one way or another, you're always assimilating in some way anyway.
You want to be Americano, but you were born in Italy. Um, no, so good points. But I think let's not forget that one of the reasons why not only the Chinese but so many other immigrants have resorted to change their names and Americanizing, quote unquote, Americanizing their names is because of the violence and the oppression that they experience. So, there were back when there was that uprising and the anti-Chinese fervor in California and other parts, they were lynching Chinese people. They were raiding their businesses, beating them up in the streets and things like that. So like, yes, like adapting, changing your name is a simple, quote unquote, simple solution to try to not be as impacted, but it's something that was a a solution to trying to blend into a very oppressive and very brutal system that telling you you're different, you don't belong here, go back to where you belong, even if you were born here. And it just so happens that you look the way you do and you're dressed the way you dress because your parents dressed you, but you were still an American citizen and you were born and you were treated differently just because you look differently. And while I agree, like I think if you're grounded on your culture, grounded on who you are, changing your name may not be a big difference, but in some sense, it is a capitulation and is giving up a little bit of you. I think, and I speak about this because from personal experience, because when I first moved to the United States, people couldn't pronounce my name, so I changed the pronunciation of my name to a more Americanized. And it wasn't just me. There was a bunch of other people who did that because the immigrant population was so small. And even though, Rhode Island wasn't like an outwardly racist place, you can still sense that tension. You can still see that people looked at you differently. I sensed that, right? When I was trying to grow up. So in some ways I was like, you know what? I'm not gonna bother teaching you how to pronounce my name. I'm gonna say it in a way that is easy for you to say it, so that way I don't have to go through this problem. And then when I actually when I got to Brown that other Latinos confronted me and say, why are you pronouncing your name this way? You should be pronouncing it in the way that is meant to be. So I think there's also a lot of power and pride to be able to say, this is who I am, this is my name, and this is how you say it, and try to say it correctly. And if you mess it up, that's fine. Just keep on trying. So I think that's another perspective that I think it seems like where your brother was coming from, which I think it's a legitimate perspective. And I think now that there's less violence and less oppressive ways to regulate that, I think people are more empowered to do that, right?
Yeah.
Yay!
You got accosted by the Latino lynch mob telling you
That's
that
the woke that they told me how unwoke I was. But it was
uh,
a good point. But that's the funny thing. Like, hey, like I was born in Colombia, so like nobody can take away from me. My culture, my language, nobody can take away from me. But it was a different experience, right? Like these were folks that were probably from California, from Puerto Rico too. And I know, there's a whole interesting story between the U.S. and Puerto Rico, but they're definitely, if you're from the island, you have a very strong sense of identity. Um, so, but
and
yeah, but I think that was part of the growth that I did and the ethnic studies. And the other thing that I wanted to mention about this documentary that ties into our our experience at Brown is that it talks about the part two, particularly the generation rising. It talks about the birth of this Pan Asian American identity, and actually that's when the in the late '60s or in the '60s, early '60s, mid '60s, and is when this identity of Asian Americans come up, which includes Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, others. But then there's a time where they form alliances and coalitions with African students, with Native students, with Asian students, and they come up with the Third World Liberation Movement. I think they called it in the documentary, going back to the Third World Center, which I know when I first went to Brown and I was invited to the Third World Transition Program, it made sense to me. I was like, okay, I was born in Colombia. Consider it's kind of the fact that you call it third world is kind of fucked up, but okay, I'll still go. And I know that's how you and I first met, but appreciating the significance of the term third world, and kind of appreciating the history and appreciating the fact that in the mid to late '60s there was so much activism and so much progress that happened not only at Brown but in campuses across the country that really helped move the civil rights movement and bring about a lot of change.
I'm not sure if I should comment on the Third World Center or if I should go back to the points that you made about holding on and feeling like if you've given up a part of yourself when you change your name.
Go back to that, and then we can, if we have the chance, we can go back to the third world.
Yeah, I'm not like I used to feel like that when I was younger. This different perspective is now as I'm older and I look at things, and the way that I look at it is you have to pick your battles, and you have to be aware enough of what's actually happening so that you can take a practical approach, because what's more important, keeping your name or getting a quality education and working really hard to try to be successful in this country by educating yourself and following a specific
But
way of
why do you
being.
have to choose?
Why do
Why
you
do
have
you
to
have to choose one or the other? Why can you have both? Why can you keep your name and have a good quality education?
Well, yeah, I mean, that'd be great if people were doing both. But do people do both? Or do people not change their name and also not pursue, uh, not focus so much on the things that actually make a big difference, right? And I'm not sure if you're following me, but the battle of a name in the grand scheme of things doesn't seem as important when you factor in the fact that it's way more important and you will do more of a service to your community if you actually focus
Hmm.
on becoming a professional, becoming a leader within your community, of bringing about change to your community, whether it's community organizing or other things. That is way more important than fixating on something that is on a name, right? I know, like, to some people, I know it's important, and if somebody wants to do both, then that's great. But
Hmm.
the other part that I look at is your culture is very fluid anyway.
Yeah,
No matter how much you try to hold on to your culture, it's going to change.
the
And
culture changes. Yeah.
yeah, and the more stubborn you are about it, the harder it's going to hit you when your kids no longer follow whatever cultural teachings you want to teach them, because they won't, right? If you're Mexican American or Colombian American, you have a certain percentage of chance that your kids are not going to like soccer. They're not going to like cumbias. They're not going to like Mexican music. They're going to like hip hop. They're going to like EDM. They're going to like something different. And you have no control over that. You can try to bring them up that way, but
Hmm.
they're ultimately, your kids are going to choose what they want, right? and
Hmm.
and they're going to marry who they want to. They're going to marry outside of the culture, which is good. And but you have a gradient of what people consider to be important in terms of their identity. I mean, some people take it to the extreme and they say, uh, keep my name definitely. At the house, we do this, and that. And I'm going to prefer, like, really emphasize or prefer, if my son or daughter marries somebody else from the Colombian community. Like, you still have Latinos like that. And so it's a
Hmm.
gradient in terms of, so to me, when I start seeing that it's a gradient and it's very subjective, where people draw the line in terms of what they think is something that they want to retain for their culture. The name is just somewhere in there, but the name is something that people fixate on because they associate it with identity. They associate it with something that defines you, and like
Hmm.
that, your name doesn't define you. Because look at your name anyway. Your name is probably from some of the Spanish colonizers, and if not from the Spanish colonizers, then it probably comes from somewhere in the Middle East, or somewhere from a biblical name or a Greek name.
Or
I mean,
Aztec name.
yeah, how many people have Aztec names of the general Hispanic population? It's like 1% or 2%. So what is it about this name anyway that defines you? Like, how are you defining your identity? Are you defining your identity based on your indigenous heritage, but yet you have a Spanish name? And that's the Spanish name that you want to pass on to your kids? And think about this. Even if you keep your name and you don't change your name to be to give yourself an edge in this American society, to whatever extent it gives you an edge, or at least it puts you in the same playing field with others, right? So it's not considered a disadvantage. Even if you keep your name, you're still carrying around a surname, your last name, which is probably from somebody in Europe. It has nothing to do with your indigenous roots. I mean, obviously, I'm talking now about Latinos. I know that with Chinese and with Asians, it's different because their names could be traced back to their culture. But
Hmm.
this is where, or I mean, to their country. But this is where I think the Chinese are very clever at this, in that they still keep their name. They make it the middle name, right? They just say,
Yeah.
"Oh yeah, yeah, we have this American name here. Call us by this." But they still retain their middle name. They still uh, focus on being very successful in this country. They still retain their culture. I don't know if I read in this article or it was the book that I read about how even in Italy there's a community of Chinese that sprang up around the textile and the fashion industry,
Hmm.
and within that community, they're so close to each other. That community is so tight knit that they refer to the Italians as outsiders. They're in
Wow.
Italy, and the Italians are the outsiders because of the way that the how close they are and how they and so the reality is that the Chinese do a whole bunch of other stuff to try to retain their culture. The name is just something that they say, this little battle we're just not gonna fight too much because first of all, like you said, maybe I think one of the biggest reasons is actually because some of the Chinese names are really hard to pronounce, so they change it, they make it a middle name, and then they put a name that's easy to pronounce so that when you're interviewing for a job, so that when you're communicating with somebody else, you don't have to worry about that. You don't lose any time. Like, hey, how do you say your name? I'll say it again. Oh, I'm sorry. Like, I didn't mean to offend you about your name. Like, you get rid of all of that by just changing the name to an American name and then move on and focus on what's next, right? What's next to become successful or to be prosperous in this country.
Interesting. No, yeah, I mean, you make a good point. And I know you also wanted to talk about, because I know the Chinese have had influence not only here in the US, but I mean, all across Latin America. I know that there's a lot of Chinese colonies or diaspora in Brazil,
Yeah.
Peru. I mean, Peru, when you think about so much of the cuisine is influenced by Chinese culture and Chinese influence. But I know Mexico has a fair amount of Chinese in their population.
Yeah, thank you for reminding me, and I'll briefly touch on this. I think I was reading an article about how tourism from China has increased significantly to Mexico. And then as a result of that, there were some other articles, and I started reading more about it. And I came across this Mexicali La Chinesca, which I had never knew anything about it. And so what it is this underground, it's like an underground city built by Chinese in Mexicali. And you can read here, it says the Chinese began arriving in the Imperial Valley region in the mid 1800s to build a railroad and then as co-workers for the Colorado River Land Company, a U.S. company that designated and constructed the extensive irrigation system in the Mexicali Valley. So a lot of them ended up staying there. And there was, at a certain point, I think like in the 1920s, most of the population in Mexicali was Chinese,
Mm.
not even Mexican. But then what happened was this new president came in, and he took the sentiment against the Chinese completely changed, so that they started targeting them and discriminating against them. I think there were even killings, and they essentially gradually chipped away and took away most of their land there, to the and you get to today where all of these underground homes and tunnels, they're not even you don't have this vibrant community anymore. What you have is you have these Mexicans that are part Chinese, part Mexican, but because of the anti-Chinese sentiment that took hold as a result of I think they were getting the taxing, the targeting of them and so forth as being outsiders, very similar to what happens here in the US, but with the Mexican flavor, which
Well, yeah, something tells me that it was the same exclusionary bug that hit the US that spread to Mexico too. And the reality of, some the perceived economic competition of Chinese labor.
yeah, so there are more than 40 basements in La Chinesca, and one of the reasons why there's documentaries about this as well, because some of the descendants of the Chinese are actually seeing an economic opportunity here because they see that if they can come in here and they can make these basements attractive to tourists, then they
Hmm.
can bring in more Chinese tourists to give them a glimpse into their ancestors and how the part of the Chinese ancestors that ended up in Mexico. Let me see if I find some information on that. During the era of prohibition, the Chinese they opened bars, casinos, hotels, and restaurants in Mexicali to attract people from the U.S. Let's see. This one doesn't really cover the crackdown on the Mexican, but for anyone that's interested in this, definitely read more about it. I just found out about this week, so I don't have as much context into the history of it, but I do know that the anti-Chinese sentiment was ultimately what led to a lot of Chinese moving away from that area, and then the entire community essentially, I wouldn't say disintegrating, but just decimating. Because if at some point most of the people in Mexicali are Chinese, and it would have stayed that way, then Mexicali would be a completely different city today. But it's not. Mexicali is just a Mexican city now, like another. So at some point, this entire history and these people was pushed out and to some extent erased.
Yeah,
You
well,
want to talk about racism, right? We always want to make it a point in this show to say that don't focus so much on American racism, because if you're Mexican and you're criticizing the U.S. of racism, look no further than your backyard to see some pretty racist policies too in your own country.
yeah, and I think we would be remiss if we don't talk about some of the racism and colorism that happens in Chinese culture too, in terms of, and then the divide between those who are from the city and the rural communities. What's happening right now with the Uyghurs in China, and how they're trying to really culturally cleanse and eliminate them. So I think that yes,
That
it's
has a polit.
unfortunately something that
Yeah.
cuts across.
We only have so much time to cover these things, and I would have loved to have gotten more into this. And at some point, it'd be great maybe if for the next time that we focus on Asian culture and stuff, we actually bring in one of our Asian friends to give us their perspective and tell us how everything that they're saying. Well, to set us straight, right? To keep us
Yep,
honest.
that would be good.
All right. Thanks a lot for the talk. We'll wrap it up.
All right, thank you all. Enjoy your happy Asian American History Month. Enjoy it and enjoy your Memorial Day weekend.
Yeah. Happy Memorial Day.